I was afraid that what if I try all of these different modalities of treatment, whatever they are. I didn't even know what they were. I couldn't even tell you, if you would have asked me what, at the time, I had, raging PTSD and survivor's guilt and moral injury and all this stuff. I couldn't even tell you what it stood for. So I had no idea. I had no context for what I was going through other than there's strong people who go to war and come home, and then there's weak people who go to war and can't deal with it. And I'm not a weak person. So I have to figure this out and get through it. But I was ultimately afraid of the idea, what if I go to get help? What if I try everything and I'm still sick? Then I'm hopeless. I didn't have the guts to say, hey, we're gonna do whatever we can to figure this out. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but we're gonna try it. Nor did I have the guts or really just even the wherewithal or awareness to understand how sick I was, to raise my hand and say, I'm not doing well, and I can't fix this on my own.
That was Steven Elliott. And today on the podcast, we hear his story of fighting in Afghanistan, his involvement with the Pat Tillman story, and his struggle with PTSD and substance abuse after returning home from the battlefield, his story of healing, and his story of passion now to be involved with other soldiers who struggle with the very same things. Steven's a reformer, and that's why we're so excited to feature him on our very first Nations Media podcast. I know you'll be enriched and encouraged by our conversation.
I grew up in central Kansas and then went to school at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And then I began basic training in the Army 3 weeks after I graduated from business school in May of 2003. So that took me from Tulsa to sunny Fort Benning, Georgia for the better part of 6 months. And then after completing all of my training there, I found myself assigned to 2nd Ranger Battalion, which is just down the road at what was Fort Lewis, what has become JBLM.
Yeah.
So that's how I wounded. That's my journey from central to east to back to the West Coast to that area.
So was this the ROTC program, or was it?
No. So I had I kind of went back and forth on that. I had. Talked to one thing I knew how to do is I knew how to do research. So I researched my options more so than the Army recruiter I think was used to when I walked into his office for the first time. But the upshot of it was 2000 at the time. It was going into my senior year. This was 2002. 9/11 was not even 12 months old. And in kind of classic, I think, youthful exuberance, I was afraid the war was going to be over. And looking back on that now, that's tragically hilarious, the fact that that was not the case. That was not something I had to worry about.
Right.
But for me, it was, I wanted to fight, and I wanted to be contributing in that way. And when you looked at the path to a special operations unit or an SF unit from an officer route, takes many more years versus going enlisted. And so effectively I did the math and looked at it and said, if I don't get hurt, if I don't recycle out of any segment of the training, I can get into effectively Special Operations Command via the Ranger Regiment within about 6 to 9 months from joining. And then having talked to folks who had sort of served in those communities and other communities around them, it seemed like if I wanted to do my 4 years and that's it, that serving in that community, I would be proud of that. That would be like, hey, I didn't spend 2.5 years in a schoolhouse only to figure out that I didn't want to do this. Right. But I could say, hey, I left as a E5 sergeant, Rangers, and I'm proud of that. Or if I said, hey, I really want to do something more, you can kind of, not to exaggerate too much, but to some degree it's true, you can sort of write your own ticket. So it's like, hey, you've been to regiment. You've deployed as a Ranger. You want to go be SF, go be SF. You want to go do any one of a myriad of things. That's a trip to include becoming an officer. That's a great starting point. So it just felt like it was the best expression of what I wanted to offer and also gave me options in my career as well.
That's amazing. Talk to me. September 11th, it's crazy. I mean, growing up in the late 70s and 80s, like hearing about the Vietnam War that was just, 15 years prior to my growing up, it seemed like an eternity ago. And now if you're growing up today, like September 11th was that. But for me, it was a very memorable moment, obviously for us all. Tell us where you were. What was that moment like for you?
I remember it was I was at ORU. It was my junior year of school. I remember that being announced at a chapel service. And I think for me, like the initial reaction, which you have the benefit of time to be able to kind of unpack, a little bit of that. At first it felt really far away. I'm sitting there in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it's just like, you have no way to contextualize it. Like, how do you contextualize that level of tragedy? And then it's also like, we don't know what we don't know in the moment either. You hear that a plane has crashed.
Right.
Then you hear a second one, and you didn't have, this makes us sound old here, Joel. We didn't have, people live tweeting or live
Twitter,
streaming what was going on.
No social media. It was all news breaking.
Yeah, it really was. So it was like, try and find a cable television somewhere to watch what's happening. And so for me, it went from like, well, what is this exactly, to then understanding and kind of being in shock as to the gravity of it. And then I think the most surprising thing about it was starting to realize just how small my world really was. I'm 20 years old, going to a small Christian school in eastern Oklahoma. What connections could I possibly have to New York City? Well, at the very least, all of a sudden, I have classmates and friends who are on the phone talking to family and talking to, you realize the connections. I had a good friend of mine from my freshman year who that day was in the World Trade Center building, going through training as a new financial advisor, and he made it out. But very, very quickly, like within 24 hours, something that felt two-dimensional on a screen, tragic, felt very violating. It felt very personal in a way that I would have never expected.
That's amazing. I remember my wife and we got married September 1st. And honeymooned in Mexico, and we flew home the night of the 10th.
Wow!
We might even arrived on the 11th.
Wow!
In the wee hours, but just waking up to a new marriage, a whole new world. It was just radical.
Wow!
Was that a catalyst for you to start thinking military, or had you already made your mind up that you wanted to be military?
I had made my mind up that I didn't want to be military. So for me, the biggest male influence in my life was my mom's dad, my grandfather. And my folks had divorced shortly after I was born, and he became, in a lot of ways, I had a lot of really great, healthy family around me, but he became really kind of a de facto dad for me. And he had served in World War II a year and a half on the Italian front. And so as a young kid, I had always seen sort of, I joke with people, I would say growing up in central Kansas around people like my grandpa, I would always say as a kid, I thought every man over the age of 60 was two things: a veteran of World War II and Lutheran, because it was essentially...
That's how it was,
right? And so everyone gets dressed up on Memorial Day and does their thing and honors those who've fallen as someone who's fallen. So I saw that as a young kid as very much... I didn't process it that way consciously, but very much a gateway to manhood. And then I want to say grew out of that, but shifted courses. And I was, dead set on going to law school, becoming an attorney, and, doing whatever. Had really no designs on military service. And then 9/11 happened, and I just couldn't shake it.
Yeah.
People, they'll tell you, thank you for your service, which is fine, or they'll look at you and say, they'll compliment you on the choice for that. And I honestly, I felt like if I didn't do that, I was just going to bust. Like, it was not even something that I felt like I didn't have a choice in a way, and not from some sort of self-righteous sort of way, but just it was just in me. And I felt like between me and whatever was on the other side of that, whatever life held for me, I felt like I needed to spend some time serving. And I think there was a lot of things wrapped up into that were both good and bad, both honorable and egotistical. Yeah. There is the element of our nation is at war. This is our generation's fight, not dissimilar to my own grandfather in 1942, 43 when he elected to serve. And so you view it through those lenses, but then you also view it through the lenses of I want to prove to myself in the world that I'm a man. And if I do this in my 21, 22-year-old brain, which is, I mean, that leads to this pedestal leads to so many other problems on the other side of war. But you have the false belief, at least I did, that serving in combat, particularly serving in special operations unit in combat, is the manliest thing that you can do, which is ridiculous. But that's what you think. And I think in large respects, that's what our culture tells us. And so then you have a lot of folks, including myself, that to some degree are set up for failure by their own expectations and their own cultural norms as far as what is required to be a man. That's a pretty divisive topic these days.
Right.
What is masculinity versus toxic masculinity versus feminism? All of these conversations, they're interwoven in our society in various ways. But I think for me, there was a selfless desire to serve, but there also was very much a selfish desire to see what can I prove to the world about who I am and what I can accomplish.
Talk to me about Ranger School. I mean, every, I think, red-blooded American dreams of becoming a Navy SEAL, or, I mean, look at all the shows on Netflix. It really captures our culture's youth, and we love the idea of fighting for something. We love the idea of winning, and Special Forces always wins.
Yes.
And so, how did you choose Rangers School over, becoming a Navy SEAL or any other special force?
I think I already had kind of a cultural affinity for the Army in general, just because, my great grandfather, he served as a medic in World War I in the Army. His son, my grandfather, served in the Army in World War II. His brother, my great uncle, was in the Army in Korea. Second cousin was a Green Beret. So it's like pretty much everyone
generational.
Everyone in my family who had military service, there was Army, and so I think there was a piece of that, and I think the idea of I can swim, but it's not my favorite, candidly. And so the Navy SEALs, I just never felt an attraction to that culture, the naval culture. Obviously high regard, high degree of respect for those folks, but felt like the Army community in general was more a fit for me. And then the Ranger selection phase. So I never actually went to Ranger school. So that's a peculiarity within the Ranger regiment. Is in order to get into the regiment, you have to go through the SEALs do a much better job of marketing and making documentaries than the Army does. So people are more familiar with BUDS.
Right.
The Army, the Ranger equivalent of that is what's now called RASP, which is the Ranger Assessment and Selection Phase.
Okay.
So that's what you go through after you've completed basic. I was an infantryman, so then you complete infantry school. Then you go to airborne school to become jump qualified. Then you go to RASP. At the time, it was called RIP when I was doing it. But then once you complete that, you don the tan beret, which is the Ranger's headgear, and you are a member of the 75th Ranger Regiment, with the expectation that at some point, in order to progress in your career, you will go to Ranger School, which is a separate leadership school that the regiment uses to effectively vet its leaders.
Gotcha.
So the idea is you're a Ranger by virtue of going through RASP and being in the unit, but if you want to stay a Ranger and actually progress in the unit, you're going to have to go to Ranger School and get your tab. And so that's most of the culture, most of the hazing in Ranger Regiment, a lot of it is built around providing very clear incentives for people to, hey, you're here, congratulations, you're not done quite yet. And so then Ranger School happens a little bit further on down the road.
Gotcha.
But yeah, the process, I mean, just from what I've seen, having not done BUDS, it's essentially both BUDS and RASP they're non-gentleman courses, meaning you volunteer, but you're not going to be treated with a tremendous amount of respect by the cadre, and it's completely discretionary, meaning they put forth criteria, like if you can, here's the standards, but I saw many guys who met the standards that the cadre just didn't like, and they just got rid of them. And so it's a very intense environment.
Being from San Diego, I've got know a lot of kids kind of through our youth program at church who, choose that route. I've got a good friend right now who he was days from completing it. And he got MRSA in his knee, and they're like, if you don't stop right now, it's amputation. And I just talked to him, and he's like, how do you feel? You got to start over. He goes, it's only pain. Once you learn that it's only pain, you can do anything. And there's a lot of talk right now on podcasts, obviously with Jocko and everybody. It's everyone's really drawn to that culture. Did you feel like, man, I fit in here? This is my world.
Eventually, no, but I think initially I was so intoxicated with the idea that I could do it that I was just super happy about that.
You were driven.
I was just driven. Yeah. And so for me, just my personality type, very achievement oriented and, those sorts of things. I think what I realized over time, and then the other thing is, I'll say this, you spend so much time, at least I did initially, thinking about, can I just get into the unit? Because what's the point of thinking about much else beyond that? You're thinking on the very next goal. You don't think about, nor do you have a lot of context for what it's like to actually be in the unit. And so I remember it dawning on me, on the flight, the day I graduated, RIP is what it was called, the Ranger Indoctrination Program. Graduate that, at 10 o'clock in the morning at Fort Benning, Georgia, and you have a plane ticket in your hand for Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. So that night, you're landing in SeaTac. And I remember on the flight thinking, like, it began to dawn on me that the reason why, because there's a lot of hazing that goes on. There's a lot of things that it's just like, you guys are just being whatever.
Mean to be mean.
Yes. Yeah. And just because you're trying to see how bad you actually want to be in this unit.
Right.
I get that. But then it began to dawn on me that the reason why the selection is so hard is because the job is actually really hard. So it's not just, can you get through our hazing BS so that you can come and, sip scotch and whiskey and, have
in the club. This isn't a seniors versus freshmen.
No,
initiation.
Not that at all. And so then as you're actually doing the job, you're just like, oh, the reason why they deprived us of sleep is because you get deprived of sleep a lot.
There's no sleep on the battlefield.
No. Yeah. And so then what I began to realize, kind of to answer your question, over time, I would describe myself, and maybe some of my comrades would, have their own assessment, but I would kind of describe myself as kind of like a B- Ranger. Like, I could do everything that I needed to do. I could meet the standards, but nobody was looking at me and saying, wow, that guy's going to Delta.
Right.
Like that guy's. And then when you're around those guys and then you see the guys who are just like their soul is fed by being in the unit, guys who live in Tacoma, they'd ride their bike 20 miles to work to be a Ranger all day and then ride home. And they were just like kids in a candy store. They just loved it. And then you begin to realize, like, there's some cool things about this, but most of it kind of sucks.
Right.
It's hard and I'll do it, but this isn't it's better. It's like certain hometowns, it's a better place to be from than a better place to be. Yeah. Like, it's a great job to talk about. And most of the time it was just a pretty difficult job to do.
Yeah.
And so I learned that over time, relatively short time that I was in the regiment, that, yeah, this was probably not, if I stay in the Army, it's probably not going to be here.
So your book is War Story. Man, I've got it all marked up. My wife just read it. She's a reader. And she was in tears. It's a very incredibly moving story. I guess the crux of your story is your interactions with Pat Tillman.
Yeah.
After September 11th, he was a hero to our culture. He was NFL player. Chose to walk away from that and enlist. And he looked the part, square jaw, he looked like what you were just describing, someone who would ride their bike 20 miles just to participate. So tell me, we'll get into your story in a minute, but just writing your narrative down, was that therapeutic? Was it painful? Was it a joy to embark on a project this massive?
Yeah. It was definitely a journey. Just, yeah, I mean, the events when we were on a deployment that happened 15 years ago, going on 15 years, which is hard to believe that much time has passed. And so, the idea that it's still rather surreal that there even is a book, because the idea that for most of those 15 years, the idea that I would even talk about it was anathema to me, just like, no thanks. It was mostly an exercise to keep that identity, which we can talk about more in a minute, I didn't want to talk about it because my military service, was really more of a mark of shame and guilt for me than it was anything else. And so, yeah, being on, the Lord has just brought us through so much, and He had to bring me through a place of healing so that I could even write it down. And I say write it down very deliberately because the story itself is not something that I wrote. I feel like I was given the opportunity with words to try and reveal something that's already there. It wasn't up to me to create the characters. It wasn't up to me to create the narrative. It was just to try and literally write it down in a way that was compelling and in a way that was honest and hopefully in a way that's helpful, so that it's not just a tearjerker for the sake of being a tearjerker, because I don't think our world needs any more of that. We've got enough things that we can cry over. But yeah, so the process of writing was when it actually came to that point, which took a while. It was really life-giving, and it was in many respects, especially revisiting some of the harder moments. I just found myself being really grateful for the work that had been done in my own heart, because in the past, revisiting some of those moments would have taken me to places that were not good. And so I'm thankful that if there was a book that needed to be written, I'm thankful that it took this long for it to happen, because it would not have been good for me any earlier. The timing of it was not my timing, and it was perfect. So, yeah.
So Pat Tillman, NFL player, so obviously so much exposure. Every person in America knows who this guy is. They know his story. He's a hero for basically living out your story, saying yes to the call of saying we want to participate in the wrongs that have been inflicted on our country. We want to go make it right.
That's right. And
so the news breaks that he's been killed in action, and I remember thinking like, wow, that just adds to the story in a huge way. I mean, someone who would be, that's the whole thing in the military, being willing to die for your country.
Yeah.
That's a radical thought if you really chew on it and think about it.
Yes.
And he did. And I remember news breaking all around. And then a month later, they uncovered that it was friendly fire.
Yeah.
So you were in his battalion?
Platoon. So yeah, Alpha Company, if there's 4 companies in the 2nd Battalion. And then we were both in Alpha Company. And then we were both, along with Kevin Tillman, his brother, all 3 of us were in the same platoon, about 35 guys or so. And then Kevin, Pat's brother, and I were in the same squad. And so Kevin and I, we worked with each other every day pretty closely. And then it was most of your training and activities at the very least are at the platoon level. So our platoon was doing all sorts of exercises together, and then our squads would split off and do stuff on their own. So, yeah. You
mentioned in the book the first time meeting Pat, and he seemed familiar, but you couldn't quite place him.
Yeah.
When did it click for you who he was, and that you were going to be working alongside of him in the battlefield?
It didn't click for a while because I didn't have, I was like, growing up, middle school, high school, I was the guy who, eat their cereal and watch SportsCenter 4 times on a Saturday morning, so like I could tell you just ridiculous facts that nobody needs to know about, every sport that was covered. I loved sports in general. Then I went to college and I didn't even have a TV. I just worked all the time and, studied. And so I didn't have really any media exposure leading up to his service. I vaguely remember hearing about some football guy who signed up. But I couldn't have told you his name even. The main thing that stuck out, but I knew that. Like I knew that some guy had done that. The The main thing about Pat was just the fact that most of the guys in regiment and a lot of types of units, because of the lifestyle, they look a lot more like me, which is they look like they just came off the soccer pitch.
Right.
Pat did not look that way. So
he looks like G.I. Joe.
Yeah, he's built and super fit, obviously. But so that, I mean, the first time I saw him, when we were waiting to get our platoon assignments, if that was there's not a lot of big guys in regiment.
That is surprising.
Yeah.
When you meet Navy SEALs and you meet Special Forces guys, they don't look like what the media makes them out to look like. I see down in San Diego, you'll see all the guys at Pendleton, you know, the Marines, just the jarheads, and they're so buff and they've got the tattoos and they're running on the beach and they've got their face masks, those oxygen preventers. And then you'll see a guy with just normal looking guy with a beard and, maybe even long hair. And he's running on the beach like a robot.
Yes.
And he's just in the soft sand going, and I'm going, yep, that's a SEAL.
Yep.
And it's amazing. But Pat he looked like an NFL player.
Yeah, he did.
Dude's huge.
He did. I'm sure he was smaller than he was when he was playing, but still, relative to the rest of us, he was an anomaly. And so that in of itself was unusual. But working with him, I guess I didn't have, I didn't have any of the expectation or buildup associated with, his choice to serve. So for me, Pat was like, oh, that's cool. He was, number one, he and Kevin both, I was one of the, which is ridiculous to say it, but at 20, the time I got to regiment, I was, I was 22. I was one of the older guys in the platoon, which is nuts. Cause you have a lot of guys who they finish high school and they go straight into the Army. Oh. And if you're good and you get through it, you can be, at regiment, by the time you're 18, 19. So I was already one of the older guys in the unit. Pat and Kevin were that much older than me, so they were like these sages. And we were, other than our platoon leader, who was a lieutenant and West Point grad, Pat, Kevin, and I believe we were the only other three guys in the platoon who had a bachelor's degree. So the three of us in general were sort of like, for whatever that's worth, seen as having had more life experience than other folks. So there was immediately some resonance with that, just like, oh, you guys have gone off and done some other things before doing the Army. And so there was some commonality there. But for me, Pat was just like, he was just a good guy that we all worked with, and, same with Kevin, just good dudes, that did their job and kind of kept their head down and were really pleasant to work with. I mean, that was my interaction with them for the most part.
So here you are, you're in the battlefield, and you're deployed, you're there. I mean, you're fighting the battle that caused, as a result of September 11th.
Yeah.
Walk us through that day that Pat was killed.
Yeah. So that was April 22nd, 2004. We hadn't been in country very long. We had been deployed as part of what they call a spring surge. So mountain passes start to open up, and folks start to move a lot more freely, particularly from the tribal regions of Pakistan in and out of Afghanistan. And so we were doing raids and patrols along the Afghan-Pakistan border. And I sort of had the idea that, at that time, we're 2.5 years into having some form of American presence in Afghanistan. I just had the assumption that, well, we've already looked everywhere, because our mission template was to go find Osama bin Laden, which in hindsight was not super accurate because he wasn't there, right. Because we have this place called the tribal regions of Pakistan, where you could sit on an OP and observation post and watch people who would be quote unquote bad guys move around and do their thing.
But you can't do anything.
Can't do anything unless our rules of engagement were if they would have to be in Afghanistan, and then we could only go into Pakistan if we made and then maintained contact with them while in pursuit to Pakistan. And you can imagine how many times that happens. So that was pretty frustrating, but was that frustrating immediately? Were you, you're brand new to the battlefield, and there's this rule that, the bad guys out there, and there's some line that you can't cross to go do your job. Yeah, it was. I remember one of the first times, because as a on your first deployment, you kind of don't know what you don't know. You're just basically just watching all the other guys, just like, well, I guess he's holding his weapon like that. I can do that, not look like an idiot. You know what I mean? Like you're literally just taking cues from
trying to fit in.
Like I don't want to be that guy. And I remember we had just pulled in after doing some patrol on the border. Depending on whose Garmin you were looking at, we were in Pakistan or Afghanistan. Just that's where we were at. And then the call came in that there was a company-size element moving towards an installation of the Afghan military force, AMF, and that we were to go augment them and just be prepared to, to get hit. And so we did that. We dug in at night. We were up all night, waiting to get shot at, and nothing happened. But that was a position that, they would get rocketed and they would get hit pretty much every week. So we just happened, I guess, not to get lucky that night. But then it became clear, like the following subsequent days, it was just like you literally could look out across the plains, past the observation post you were at. And yeah, you could see people, moving and doing, their thing unmolested. And so it felt like I thought we were the types of guys that you sent after those types of guys. So what's the deal?
It's backwards.
It began to feel more and more like, so we're here to hopefully stumble on some intelligence that can lead us to high-value targets of some sort, or we're here maybe to get shot at, and then that gives us people to pursue. But it definitely, the feeling was that our aggressiveness was curtailed, and that was, with my limited perspective, you don't sit around and talk about that. You don't sit down with your squad leader, platoon sergeant, and sharpshoot the battalion commander's strategy. That's not how it works.
Right.
You shut up and you do your job. But then with your peers, you're sort of just like, what are we doing? Like, what's happening here? Like, Bin Laden was not in that village. I'm pretty sure he's not going to be, you know what I mean? Like, so then you begin to wonder, it's a lot of work to get there. It's a lot of work just to deploy. Obviously the risk and all that. And so then you begin to feel a little bit like, what are we doing here? And is this the best use of these resources? And at the end of the day, you have such a limited perspective that in some respects you're, in this case, an Army Ranger on the ground, you have tremendous perspective that most people don't have. But at the same time, you have horrible perspective because you're the guy. You're literally as microscopic within the battlefield as you can possibly be. And you don't have perspective of others. It doesn't mean that, those in higher authority are always right, but it's easy to dismiss your own perspective as just being narrow and at the end of the day, it doesn't even matter because you have to wake up and do whatever you're told to do anyway. So, why work yourself in a tizzy trying to question it too much when you're in the midst of it? So yeah, it was frustrating.
So you guys, your unit is moving through a mountain pass, and you guys split up.
Yeah. So it had been a frustrating. So after spending some time sort of augmenting various AMF posts and doing patrols, ultimately we had one of the vehicles we'd been on mounted patrol, so riding around in basically stripped down versions of Humvees, and one of those vehicles had mechanical issues that was persistent and was ultimately, non-operable. We had tried to get replacement parts flown to us, and for whatever reason that I still don't know, logistically that wasn't possible. We could get resupplied with other things, but for whatever reason they just didn't have the part we needed. And so effectively what happened was having this broken vehicle was putting us further and further behind our timeline of clearing operations and, hitting other grid squares that, Hire wanted us to hit. And so ultimately we were given the order to tow the vehicle out, which given the nature of the quote unquote roads we were on, felt a little ridiculous because if we were driving, it was mostly on these very, very rocky wadis that are just in between mountains. And so we tried that for not even a day, and it just, tore the machine apart.
Yeah, I've seen the video. It looks like it's like even being on horseback would be difficult.
Be terrible.
You're trying to. It's like a 4x4.
Yeah, so you could literally watch like tow bars broke, tow straps broke.
Everything.
You could literally watch the terrain. It looked like at times it was literally eating the vehicle. just chewing it up. That's how, because it was not anywhere close to a hardball road. So then we were stuck.
How exposed did you feel this whole time? Because
Fairly exposed.
It looks like the scene from Indiana Jones when
yes,
when the enemies are up on the hillside and you're just, I mean, were you just looking up to the horizon the whole time?
So we made a perimeter in our vehicles, pulled security while our PL was on the radio, our platoon leader, Lieutenant Utlaut, basically trying to figure out what's next. What we were asking for one of two things. One, allow us to pull the sensitive equipment off this vehicle and just let guys jump in other vehicles. And we got enough C4, we'll blow it up. Just be done with it. Like by the time we get it back to the fob, there's not going to be a whole lot left for you to retrieve, or get us a helicopter to sling load it out. But we are, the upshot of it was we understand there's frustration because we're not fully operational as a platoon. So help us get fully operational by dealing with this broken down vehicle.
How far are you from your base? Where
we're about, I don't, off the top of my head, I don't remember as a crow flies how many miles, but we were still a solid, probably like 3-hour drive to Hardball Road, and then another 3 to 5 hour drive on Hardball Road. So as the crow flies for a bird, maybe a 30, 45 minute flight. Not far in that regard, but on ground,
sure.
A number of hours.
And especially because of the terrain.
Yeah. So we sat there, listening to the banner back and forth, and basically over the objections of our PL, they said, we want the vehicle back, and you get the vehicle back to us, and that's your job. And at the same time, because you're behind, there is another objective that we need you to hit tonight. And so our PL objected to that again, because splitting of an element, particularly in that terrain, you reduce your combat effectiveness, obviously, but then you also create some communication issues that can arise, because quite literally with the radio systems, if you don't have some point to point, you're not going to be able to communicate. So we sat there for pretty much the better part of a day watching crowds of Afghan locals pretty much gather. And that was the first time where it felt like we had lost whatever initiative that we had, which was a very unusual feeling because we're Rangers. And so that's what you do, is you have the initiative. And that's what you do is primarily you fight at night.
And you're losing ground. Were there cell phones back then? Did the villagers have cell phones?
I don't know. I think there was some, but it was definitely, at the same time that you're trying to, I'm on my weapon, you're trying to play it cool. You're not staring down your gun barrel at a kid or anything like that, but it's very tense. And the frustration for us as a platoon, we could see the vehicle that was being destroyed by the terrain, and the idea that we had to drag this thing back just felt increasingly ridiculous. That was the order that was given. And so basically our platoon leader was told, you can do that. My understanding, you can do this, or you cannot be a platoon leader for 2nd Platoon anymore. And so he did that, split the platoon. With one element's job, one half of the platoon was charged with escorting this vehicle back to a hardball road where an actual military, basically wrecker, would come and get it. And then the other half of the platoon was charged with clearing another objective. And so I was in the half of the platoon that was escorting the vehicle back to the hardball road. And then Pat was in the element of the platoon that was to go and clear this other objective that night. So by the time that was all decided, by the time it was clear that this is what we have to do, and by the time we then hired locals driving what we call a Jenga truck to then haul and pull the busted down Humvee. And so, which it felt like at a certain point, which we had no other choice. So then it felt like this was getting more ridiculous by the moment in terms of, our mission effectively having devolved into not just being a really probably the most highly armed wrecking crew in, the world, to then having to rely on locals that we didn't know
Sure.
To then lead us out into that movement. And then we started our movement at the worst possible time of the day, which is as dusk was beginning to come on. So lighting is getting bad, but it's not getting bad enough to where night vision does anything for you. So then we moved out, and the Serial 1, which is what Pat's element was called. They moved out. They left. They went to go do their thing. And then some amount of time, some minutes later, then we left. And I was manning a M240 Bravo machine gun in the Humvee that was immediately behind the Jenga truck driver and the busted down vehicle. And so then, as that, there was miscommunication. We were going to take one route, but then the Jenga truck driver advised us to take another route. And we took that route. Unbeknownst to me and most of the guys, the route that we ended up taking was the route that Serial 1 had already taken. So we ended up following them down a canyon, the likes of which at certain points, I wasn't even sure if our vehicle would fit. That's how narrow it was. And by that point, it's dark, the rocks are gray. We're joking with each other in the vehicle just to cut the tension about how, you know what this is, about how easy it would be to do X, Y, and Z, and just kind of crossing your fingers and hoping you make through that terrain when you have all these other things that we have just, as a unit, completely failed at in terms of command and control and timing of movement. And it just felt very much like the tail was wagging the dog. Like, so what is the sense of urgency that you have to have boots on the ground by dusk, which was the order for Pat's element? Why is this? I understand not treating your equipment lightly. It's critical. But why can't you trust the word of the officer on the ground as opposed to trying to command and control from the fob? So there was a lot of frustration. And then as the canyon widened out, IED goes off, boulders start flowing, drivers in the Jenga truck jump out, and the canyon is so narrow that we can't maneuver around them. So we're stuck. And so you sit there for what feels like a very long period of time. I remember feeling very, with complete assurance that I would die here. And I've never had that feeling about anything, but I had the feeling just looking at the sum total of events and decisions that had led us there, looking at the terrain that we were in. If we were initiating that ambush, it's shooting fish in a barrel. There's no reason why any of us... You
wouldn't be victorious being on the hillside as opposed to being...
Yeah, and it was too easy. You have literally a series of vehicles that are trapped in a canyon. It would be far too easy to completely decimate that group.
The IED, did it completely block your path? Was it like an avalanche of rocks coming down? Or?
It was behind me. It was I'm on the back of the vehicle on a 240 is a belt-fed machine gun, and it's attached on a swing arm to the back right portion of the vehicle. So I'm sort of almost facing to our 4 or 5 o'clock in the vehicle. So I can look back, I see the incandescent light, you see the light first before you hear it, and then the explosion happens right at the base of a massive, size of a Volkswagen Beetle boulder, and you're just watching the path of that boulder, hoping it doesn't hit anybody. It lands between vehicles, didn't hurt anyone.
Oh my gosh.
But then at that point, you know that that you're in a bad space. And so then within, a few moments, small arms fire starts happening, other explosions start taking place. And then, we start keying off of our leaders in the vehicle, myself, and then my gunner who was on a 50 cal in our vehicle. We had a lot of firepower. And so we were looking for targets to engage.
Just muzzle flashes.
It's all pretty much all you can see.
You don't see anybody.
You don't see anybody. So, yeah.
Did you feel you were trained for that moment? Was this the first time you'd been used a gun in battle?
Yep, the first time.
Did you feel like, I'm ready for this, I'm trained for this? And were you just like, I would just be freaked out now?
I felt like, so I can't speak for other parts of the military. I can speak for being an Army Ranger. They prepare you very, 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 very well. Very realistic training. So, we'd done live fire exercises that were, very realistic multiple times. You fire, you think, shooting a weapon is cool, and it is. Not when you have to go to a range and fire 10,000 rounds. Like the amount of rounds that I put through in training, that I put through my weapon, shooting at human silhouettes, I can't even tell you, a lot. So in that respect, yes. What no amount of training, I think, can prepare you for is the fact that we as human beings are not wired to kill other human beings. We're just not.
Yeah.
And that is certainly not a test of masculinity. And so in that moment, for me, I was essentially building new muscle memory and building new pathways, as it were, that would enable me to fire and possibly kill another human. But my initial reaction at first was complete and utter confusion because it made no sense to me. It made no sense that people that I don't know
want to kill you.
Want to kill me and my friends.
You talk about this in the book.
Yeah.
You talk about facing an enemy that wants to kill you, and that's something that you just can't perceive unless you've been there. I mean, I grew up and loved war movies and everything, and just working on a documentary placed me in Iraq and being on the front lines with ISIS and being bombed and being shot at. I'm just going, this is nuts. Like just the fact that they want to end my life. And a suicide bomber, they found out Americans were in this certain location. They sent a suicide bomber in, and one of my Peshmerga friends sent me a photo of just him holding up a leg. Jeez. And he goes, you just missed it. Jeez. They came for you. Gosh. And I couldn't wrap my mind around the fact that someone ended their life just trying to end mine. And so I can't even fathom being in a position where you're trained to fight back. I'm just there to document. You're there to engage this threat.
Yep.
And here you are. So you're shooting at silhouettes. What takes place from there? Yeah.
So eventually you get leadership in our serial, basically at gunpoint, get Jenga truck drivers back in the vehicle and get that moving. So eventually we're moving again, and we stopped a couple times to engage other targets as we were coming out of the canyon. But that initial sense, the initial sense of confusion, then you're just keying off of people who are more senior than you.
Yeah.
And then a switch is flipped. Once I fired the first 3-round volley, I went cold. In my heart, in my mind, it was that new pathway was established, where I knew that I was shooting. I wasn't just closing my eyes, pulling the trigger. I was aiming and deliberately trying to kill another human, and that changes you. And so, but as we were moving through it, a couple things start dawning on you. Number one, our serial, for whatever reason, didn't really take effective fire. There was no rounds kicking up around us. There was no explosions happening close to our vehicle. No one had been hit. We're moving through it. And so the initial sense of assurance that we're done changes to we actually might be okay. And then as we gained speed and came out of the canyon, there was muzzle flashes coming from an individual. At this point, it's almost 6:30 at night. The sun is set already, so whatever we're seeing to the right side of the vehicle is all backlit, whatever light that there is. And our squad leader in the vehicle, he engaged that individual, shot him 6 times. We keyed off of that fire, and I fired a few other volleys at shapes that I could only assume were the enemy, because the idea that there were friendlies anywhere around us that was not in our vehicles was just completely impossible to me. And so,
because there's no communication, you're in a valley. There's no AWAC above you that's bouncing signal.
No, we don't know. We know that our element is very much in the valley on their vehicles. We had no idea. Ultimately, what we discovered, we engaged that. We pulled off to the side. I was pulled off the vehicle with my gun and sent to the other side of the objective to pull security, basically. And so I set up pretty much for the rest of the night, and had some communication with my squad leader as things, but all that was developing a couple hundred yards behind me. And what ultimately had happened was, we believing The individual that our squad leader shot and killed was an AMF fighter who was fighting with us and fighting with Serial 1, which is where Pat was. And so the position that our squad leader identified as being an enemy position by virtue of his fire was actually a friendly position. And so we had fired. We found out the following day that we had, those of us in our vehicle had fired in that position. And as a result, we had sustained 4 casualties, all of them as a result of friendly fire, 2 killed and 2 wounded. The 2 that were killed was the AMF soldier and, of course, Pat. And then our platoon leader, David Outlaut, and then our RTO, the radio transmission operator, they were both hit. But all those rounds were from us.
So you get back to base here,
yeah,
and you start. This information starts coming out. Or what are you thinking in this moment? What are you feeling besides obviously heartache?
Yeah, it was at first. It was the initial thing that we knew. Literally the following day, right before we moved back to the FOB, we knew that it was friendly fire. And then we knew that there were 50 cal rounds that were in the rock behind where Pat was killed. And so the immediate assumption was that it was my immediate superior and 50 cal gunner, Stephen Ashpole, who killed him. But at the same time, we all knew that we fired there. So it was ambiguous in a way, but it was, in retrospect, we were in shock. We didn't know how to feel about any of that. And so yeah, there was a lot of, we went back to the FOB. It was not in dispute on any level that it was friendly fire. And in fact, we then, there was an Article 15.6 investigation that began immediately, which 15.6 is just an informational investigation. We're just trying to figure out what happened. So that happened immediately. We were instructed on no uncertain terms. My squad leader made it very, very plain that you do not lie. You don't have to remember everything. They don't expect you to remember everything, but you tell them the truth as best as you remember it. And so that's what we were told. We were told not to talk about it outside of the unit, which is pretty easy because that's the last thing anyone wants to talk about. And then we had, within a few days of getting back, we had what they call a critical incident debrief, where the entire platoon, Kevin and Russell Bear, who went with Kevin to accompany Pat's remains, they were absent. And of course, Lieutenant Outlaut and Jade Lane, the RTO, those guys were gone. But the rest of us sat in a tent, led by Chaplain and, our acting PL, who was platoon sergeant, and conducted a critical incident debrief, which the idea was to just let everyone share their perspective, not assign blame, but just try and create understanding. And that was the first time that I actually had a full understanding situationally of who was where, and really just the horror of it, the horror of what happened, but then also the horror of what could have happened, beyond as bad as it was. There's a number of other guys that could have easily been killed by us accidentally. And so I felt much more the weight of their possible death than I felt the relief of their life. And so, so that's out. But then regiment was very anxious to, in the remaining weeks that we had in country, to quote unquote get us right back on the horse. And so we were right back out doing raids and patrols again. And so it was pretty easy to compartmentalize, and it was pretty easy to lean into the shock that you were already in at that moment.
That's amazing to me that our minds work that way, that you can just, kind of put it back on the bookshelf and move on. You started to kind of put the Legos together and follow the breadcrumbs, and you came to a realization. Walk me through that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it became clear just based on a couple things became clear. Once we finally got back, then it became clear. Number one, I didn't know that there had been, a nationally televised memorial service for Pat. I didn't know that. I had never heard or read his Silver Star citation, which was pure fiction, in terms of how his death was characterized. I didn't know any of that. And I don't think really any other guys in the unit did, because we were still in Afghanistan. And so I was operating under the assumption that, it was that obvious to us what happened. Well, of course, that's going to be communicated properly to the family, et cetera. And it wasn't until we got back and it became evident that Kevin didn't know what had happened. And that's when things really started unraveling pretty quickly.
He was thinking that he was believing the narrative that was being told back in the United States.
Correct. And so so that started to unravel. And then the family rightly started asking more questions because things just didn't add up.
What was that narrative?
The narrative was essentially that, Pat died, charging an enemy position in a glorious hail of gunfire, to protect his platoon mates, So, which the thing is, like, the way that he died, as tragic and completely, awful as it is, it doesn't, in my mind, as far as his intensity and his desire to serve, absolutely is not diminished. It's just that the only thing that you can do at that point to diminish his memory is then to lie about it. And that's what happened. And that happened purely for selfish reasons, to try and create a hero narrative that would serve the Department of Defense.
That's just backwards to me. I just can't see how you'd think that this would end up well. I mean, I make films, and I know when there's truth and there's non-truth, and you're just constantly battling that the ethics of, well, if I twisted this, it might make the film better, but how do you sleep at night? I don't see how that.
I don't either. I think there's a lot of, I don't really spend much time on that anymore, and I certainly have at times trying to figure out what did you think was going to happen, to whomever it was that was in the chain of command that was making those decisions. And quite frankly, I don't know, but I do know two things. I know that I think some of the greatest evil that we have done as humans is done based on the concept of the ends justify the means. And that leads us down some pretty dark roads where we say, you know what, if we lie about this one thing and this one person, but it helps us achieve some bigger objective, then it's worth it. I have to believe there was some of that. But then I also can't help but wonder that culture, infantry, special operations, etc., is as regimented and hierarchical culture as you will find anywhere in the world. And the idea, I think it would be easy, I'm guessing, but I think it would be easy for somebody in a position of authority in those units to, over time, not be able to comprehend the idea that their orders and or their narrative would not be adhered to, because that's ultimately what happened. It was really Brian O'Neill, who was with Pat right next to him when he was killed, and who was asked to sign the Silver Star citation, and he said no.
Wow.
He said, "I'm not going to sign that. That's not true. That's not what happened." And Brian, he faced just enormous pressure to do that, and to his credit, he didn't cave. But I think that an average Joe Ranger, which Brian was, which I was on our first deployment, saying no to their chain of command, that doesn't happen.
Right.
And so I think I have to believe on some level that there's just a big cultural disconnect between how this unit functions and, to some degree, the godlike level of authority that certain commanders have, and how that bumps up against the rest of the world, and truth, for that matter.
Sure. Yeah, we had a hero even before he, set foot in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
He was, just the act of quitting the NFL and fighting for the country. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And so the higher ups are like, well, we're not going to let this story end by friendly fire.
No.
That's too devastating to this plot. So how long after did you start to kind of put the pieces together?
It was pretty ambiguous for a while. Like, I knew we had fired there. I knew my rounds, for instance, were the ones that hit
the smaller rounds, not the 50 cal.
They're a 7.62 millimeter round. Eventually, we came to realize that the nature of Pat's wounds were such that it wouldn't have been a 50 cal round because that was too large. That it was probably either myself or a saw gunner on the vehicle who was firing a weapon with a 5.56 round. And so originally, I think I pushed it out of my mind, and I just didn't want to engage that question. But then eventually, as subsequent investigations came out, that was the conclusion. The conclusion was by those experts that either it was a 5.56 or it was a 7.62. And based on who was there and based on us in our vehicle, it means it was either me or one other guy. And so that happened within probably a year of being over there and all that occurring.
This much time, a year,
Mm-hmm.
and just not knowing, was that haunting you? Just even the possibility?
I think I was in shock for a long time, and so I could not put words or really even coherent thoughts to the feelings of guilt, the feelings of shame, the rage, the anger, all of that. I think it was just so overpowering that it almost is like my system kind of just shut down in a way. But then once it started to kind of reboot a little bit, then it was pretty. I'm not sure how to describe it, but it just feels like you're. It feels like you're walking around with your crime kind of tattooed on your forehead. I felt exposed. I felt like everyone knew what I had done, which was crazy. Like the vast majority of people didn't have a clue. Certainly not the barista at the coffee shop, making my drink for me. But just that, even those public engagements, you just feel like you are just a marked man walking through the world, hoping that people don't ask the right questions or stumble into what it is that you did.
Yeah, finding out that you're the guy who took out a national hero.
Possibly, yeah, and the piece, because that was always the thing for a while. That's why I never really talked about my service, was because it's not normal. Like, you get to Ranger Regiment November of one year, and then you're reassigned from Ranger Regiment, June of the following year. That doesn't happen usually because you're a smashing success as a Ranger.
Right.
So just even that narrative, as you talk to people, just like, oh, you were in the military. Oh, so-and-so. Like even that, the thing that I thought was going to be a source of pride became absolutely epitome of shame.
Wow.
And I didn't want to get anywhere near it. And so I would never tell people that I was, I would barely tell them I was an infantryman, let alone in regiment, because then depending on where the line of questionings went, it was just like, oh, no way, my brother was at ACO. Did you know? Then you have to
play that game.
What lie am I going to tell to sort of dance around this? Because you're just making chit chat in a church lobby. Do you really want me to tell you that I'm maybe one of the guys that killed Pat Tillman? I don't think that's what you were bargaining for. But that's the sort of that's the sort of math that I got used to doing. And I basically, in that regard, as it related to that, I just figured as quickly as I get out of the Army and as quickly as I could hang other achievements on my life, then that would cumulatively drown out whatever failure that there was while I was in uniform.
Wow. Was it ever concluded that one or the other, or is it still a question mark?
We don't know. Yeah, it's not conclusive at this point, and that I think that has a lot to do with the fact that there wasn't. I don't think the level of forensics analysis done at the point of the engagement that probably should have been done, but that's the assessment that we have so far.
Did you and the other gunner have any conversations over there?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really talk about it much. No, I mean, we didn't talk. Nobody wanted to talk about it.
Sure.
And when we got back, Ashpole, he kind of checked out. Alders, who was the 5.56 saw gunner, he and I talked a fair bit, and he was pretty. I mean, everyone was, pretty wrecked as a result of it, but didn't really have the tools to even understand it. Right. Like there wasn't a context for like what is a quote unquote, what is a range of normal responses to this. You didn't know. It's just like, well, John Wayne just picks up his weapon and moves on. Yeah. So I guess that's what we do, right? So we didn't know really even how to deal with it. And then we certainly, you just kind of want to pretend. You want anything that feels normal.
Right. That
doesn't feel like life-altering, blow your world apart. You're just like, let's clean our weapons and watch The Family Guy because this sucks.
Yeah.
And I don't want to talk about it. So that was more or less the attitude.
You mentioned music in your book, Jack White, Metallica. It's kind of the Apocalypse Now scene.
Yes.
When you hear that music today, does it take you back? Is it how real is it today, 15 years later removed?
Yeah, it is. Music and smells; those two things have really powerful abilities to bring back memories of any type. The main thing for me is like I still like that music and in certain degrees, but I think there were times where like I needed it. I'm of the belief that the music we chooses us, and so when I'm clicking through my playlist, I'm not looking for something to make me feel a certain way. I'm looking for the thing that helps express where I'm at.
Wow.
Like there were times, particularly in the military and even a lot of years in the follow-up of that, where I was riddled with anger and I was riddled with questions and I was riddled with a lot of things. And so a lot of music like that, I needed it. And so now it's not even so much for me, it's like I don't, I hear that sometimes or listen to it and it's fine. It's not like a pathway to a dark world or anything. It's more of a reminder for where I'm not, and just that I'm thankful that I'm not in that place anymore. Black Album especially was always funny because that was the joke at the time, our cultural moment, early 2000s. Somehow it was like somebody had it was somebody's duty to make sure somewhere at 2nd Ranger Battalion, the Black Album was playing at all times.
Oh,
I don't know how that was, but
that's epic.
One guy, I remember in the our gym, this was like we had a massive computer with somebody had Napstered whatever playlist in the gym. And one of the most scary moments I ever saw when I was at regiment was the reaction from a squad leader at somebody who had put on Dave Matthews Bands in the 2nd Ranger Battalion gym. That was not going over. That was not going to happen. It needed to be loud. It needed to be angry and mean. That was the soundtrack. So,
oh man, that gets me excited. I met, actually, I saw Lars Ulrich at an event I was working at, and I just walked up to him and just said, "Hey man, thank you."
Really?
And he looked at me. He goes, "For what? Like, who are you and for what?" I just go, "For being the soundtrack to my youth."
Yeah, seriously,
it has so much power.
It does. And it allows it. I remember for that, even me, like some of those songs, you're in a bad place. Not that they were in a bad place when they wrote it or performed it, but it's just like it's expressing usually some pretty dark and confusing things. Yeah. And at least you felt like you're not the only one. Right. At least you felt like, okay, there's other people asking these questions and trying to sort this out. So
yeah, and there's a spirituality to it as well. And growing up in youth group, it's like that was part of going to camp, right? It's like with all heads bowed and eyes closed. Right. Raise your hand if you want to burn your Metallica CD. And I'm like, I don't know if I want to do that.
Thank you.
And I think there's some beautiful lament that is in there, and I think it's spiritual. I just don't think things are secular. I think it's all God's at some level. And
I agree.
So, okay. So your journey home, you've had this horrific war experience. You're home. What was it like setting foot on U.S. soil after being in Afghanistan?
It was great. I mean, part of it is just that there's so many sensory things that are occurring. Like you are legitimately happy to be back. And there is a feeling that, okay, everything that happened over there will stay over there and we can kind of turn the page. So there was a lot of, I would call them sort of false finales. Okay, I gave my statement for the first investigator and then I went back out on patrol. I guess that's done. Okay, there's another one. Well, I gave my statement then and then we're back on, so I guess we're done. Oh, now I get back and, all these other things happened during the course of my military career. But then there's a lot of, I would say a lot of false finales. So you're just happy to be home and then operating under a really high degree of naivete because you can't possibly fathom the personal implications of what's happened, nor can you fathom or understand the broader implications of all that had happened with how Pat's death was characterized and what was going on, how that dovetailed with the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan and these much bigger conversations that were far more consequential at a national level than just the death of one person. So, pretty happy to be back, but pretty clueless, largely.
Any girls in your life at this time to come home to?
So prior to deployment, I had met a girl named Brooke, and
It's my mom's name.
is it really?
Yeah.
So I don't think it was her, but met Brooke, and we hadn't started dating prior to deployment, but we came back. I came back, and we went on our first date. Gosh. This is recorded now. I need to remember the date because she does. But we went on our first date in, I believe, June of that summer of 2004. And
Here in the Seattle-Tacoma area?
Yeah, like I picked her up at our house in Puyallup, and then we went down to Stillicum, had dinner, went back to 72nd Street Starbucks in Tacoma, and sat and talked for hours. And it was weird. Like she asked me, it felt really evident, I think, for both of us that there was something kind of maybe more kind of stirring. And I was the time I would wear a silver KIA bracelet. You see some guys wearing, that have the name date of somebody had been killed in action. And at regiment, we were all encouraged to, learn the story of a fallen ranger and to wear a KIA bracelet accordingly. And so I wore, at the time I was wearing a guy by the name of John Mark Price, who he was in, or I was in his platoon, but he was a member of 2nd Platoon who jumped into Panama in '89 and died on the jump. And so she was just sitting there, and she just asked me about my bracelet, and I just kind of told her, and it just felt super weird. Like I'm sitting here at that time, it was evident that I was probably going to be released from regiment for what happened, and my future in the Army was pretty uncertain, and a lot of things just had a big question mark, and it just felt super weird to just not tell her what was going on. And so on our first date, she asked me kind of about deployment a little bit, and just told her. And she didn't have a container for that either. She wasn't glued into press or national media. She didn't know. I think she would say that it just felt really heavy and really sad, but also I guess maybe strangely appropriate that I told her. It just felt like this big thing that's governing my life that could impact the direction of my life just at a very basic level. And to not have that on the table just felt weird. And so we went on that date, and then we continued dating that summer until I was reassigned to the East Coast to finish my enlistment.
So a long-term relationship?
Yeah, long-term, long distance. So we were dating in 2004. I was bouncing around doing various things in the Army on the East Coast in that beginning September of 2004. And then by the following August, we were married. And then we spent the next, we spent pretty much 2.5 years apart, part of that dating, part of that being married, until my term of service was over in May of 2007. So yeah, we'd had this relationship. By the time I got home, I'm out of the military, back to the job in Olympia, Washington, which is where we moved to in 2007. We'd been married for, at that time, almost 2 years, but had really never lived together for more than a week or 10 days at a time. And so, and she didn't have any idea really of what I was, the level of what I was going through at all during the course of that. And so yeah, that was another, some of your more stressful things.
That's stressful without your history.
Yeah.
And so you're balancing this relationship, you're balancing a career that has, huge trauma in it. Just war alone, we see so many veterans with PTSD and just the guilt of a complete and total accident. How are you coping with this at the time? New marriage, new life, and a history.
Work and alcohol. Those are the two things. So I had never drank before being in the Army. I wasn't a prude about it. It's just I had never done it. And then within, probably 6 months of being back home, nightmares were becoming more persistent, agitation, a lot of restlessness, hypervigilance, ultimately what, was post-traumatic stress disorder. And I started self-medicating, just to sleep. And so that, I was pretty high functioning in that regard. Like I could still, I could drink a ton, one night, wake up, and then go do my job. And part of that was because you're 23, you can get
Sure.
away with a lot that you can't now that we're old. But yeah, so, and then I poured, all my energies. I was, hired with a pretty large wealth management firm, good, quote unquote, good job, also stressful. And so that's where you're just trying to fill your mind and fill your heart with things that don't allow the other things to kind of creep into the present. And so whatever you can do to distract yourself, whatever you can do to make yourself feel better, to medicate from that pain, that's what I was doing. And so, but it was largely work and alcohol.
Boy, this story never ends good. How does this progress? Where do you go from here? Was alcohol enough? Did you start dealing with, getting into drugs or pills or? I
didn't. And I think that's, really, but by God's grace. I mean, I look at, particularly at that time, how easy both for civilian and military, to access, opioids and whatnot. And I never did. I never had any injuries, quote unquote sports injuries while I was in that put me in that realm of having to make that choice. So, I don't know if I would have, but I never did. I mean, alcohol was essentially, my drug, my medicine of choice, and caffeine. You're trying to
uppers and downers.
Uppers and downers. It's just like whatever I can do to get myself amped up to face the stress of the workday, and then that's done. And whatever I can do to kind of wind down, and diet deteriorates, exercise, all sorts of things that in and of themselves aren't going to make you feel good. But that's just layers and layers on top of a lot of other hurt.
So you're a Christian at this time, and I mean, you grew up in a Christian household. You go to a Christian university.
Yeah.
And where's God when you get home from this? Where's God when you're turning to the bottle? I mean, right and wrong. Are you starting to see red flags, and are you asking for help, or are you just kind of content with where you're at?
I came to the point before I got out of the military, as even more investigations unfolded and as criminal accusations unfolded and were ultimately dismissed, and the stress and strain of that, it came to a point to where I would say, and I'm not going to get into the whole, like, when are you quote unquote saved or when are you not? Like, if you can tell me in the Gospels when any of the disciples were saved, I'll give you a medal, because
it's when all heads bowed and eyes are closed.
That's right.
You raise your hand, right?
That's right, which I did that about 12 times just to make sure that it took.
It's when you burn your Metallica CDs.
That's right.
Of course.
That's right. So no, like, I mean, I believe that, the work of the Holy Spirit was definitely true in my life prior to that. But the way that I describe it is, I was the oldest son in the story of the prodigal son leading up to deployment. I'd be the guy who would look back and say, gee whiz, that story, prodigal son, that is so great. It's so good to know that God can love even people like that, even though I don't relate with that sort of waywardness and that sort of whatever, like, which that in of itself is this just ink blot test of sin and self-righteousness.
Yeah.
Which is like the fact that that's who you identify as the good guy in the story is a problem,
right?
And needs to be addressed, and puts you on some pretty shaky ground. And so I basically, pick a term, moralistic therapeutic deism certainly fit a lot of my concept, where I believe that being moral was a good thing. Mm-hmm. I derive my morality from Scripture, from the Hebrew and Christian Bible. I believe there was a God, and I believe that He was there to help me out to have my best life now. And so none of this fit in that scenario. In fact, it felt like a cruel joke, because it would have been better in my mind at the time. Like, I could have been killed in combat, at least I'd be dead. I could have been wounded in combat, at least that would have been honorable. But now I'm a dead man walking. Now you've left me physically alive, but what am I supposed to do with this? What am I supposed to do with this? And so it felt cruel. It just felt like God is either all loving or He's all powerful, but He's not both. And my bet was that He's all powerful and He could fix this, He could fix the pain, or He could have kept me out of the situation, but He chose not to, which means He doesn't love me that much. And so even before getting out of the Army, I stopped going to church. In my heart, I basically said, you know what? I can be a good person. I'm not a serial killer. I'm not, however you want to draw the lines of morality in your life, I'm on the right side of it. And I don't need the complications of any of this to go live my life and do what I'm going to do. And so I walked away from the Lord. I didn't want to have anything to do with it, just because I was operating in hurt. And that, again, that just reveals, frankly, the shallowness of my own belief structure, really, going into that.
So you're angry, and that's it's got to feel like a just anger.
Yeah, it does, because it is and it isn't, because, and that was always sort of the math that was maddening about it, was the fact that there was, on the one hand, to take full responsibility for what happened is in and of itself a ridiculous expression of pride. I wasn't that important. There was all sorts of decisions that were made prior to my decision to pull the trigger that helped contribute to that. So, but at the same time, I pulled the trigger. And so there was periods of time where it was this sort of maddening sort of calculus you're trying to do to say, okay, like, what is the penance I'm supposed to pay? Like, what is the amount of pain that's just, knowing that on the one hand, I'm angry at other people for what they did or didn't do, but at the same time, I'm angry at myself for what I did.
Wow.
And so it was just a giant mess.
You say in the book that the Bible doesn't solve the problem of pain, is kind of where you're at, and so
No.
there's no help there. God's not helping. You felt alone. Did you feel close to Brooke in this time?
I did initially. I think particularly when when I was still in the military and we were having a long distance relationship, that was really the lifeline in a lot of respects, because it was always something external to me that was the problem. It was, well, I'm still in the military and we're separated by a continent, which is painful and difficult. As soon as I'm out of the military, then it'll be behind me and that'll be better. And then you get out of the military and it's just like, well, I'm new job, new area. As soon as I get that figured out, then I'll be fine. And then financial crisis hits and I'm in the worst possible industry, one of the worst industries for that.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And so then it's just like, well, as soon as that's over.
2008?
Yeah. So I started in the industry in 2007. And so there was always something that wasn't me that was the problem. And then eventually Brooks, pleadings with me. I mean, she had a front row seat to my destruction in those years.
Sure.
And so her pleadings with me, like, you need to talk to somebody. Like, why don't you talk to somebody? Like, can't you talk to somebody? I'll go with you. And I would never argue with her. It was never just like, oh, you're crazy. It was just like, yeah, you're probably right. But I was afraid. And
what were you afraid of?
I was afraid that it's so stupid, the logic that you find yourself in at times in the midst of pain. I was afraid that, what if I try all of these different modalities of treatment, whatever they are? I didn't even know what they were. I couldn't even tell you, if you would have asked me what, at the time, I had, raging PTSD and survivor's guilt and moral injury and all this stuff. I couldn't even tell you what it stood for. So I had no idea. I had no context for what I was going through, other than there's strong people who go to war and come home, and then there's weak people who go to war and can't deal with it. And I'm not a weak person. So I have to figure this out and get through it. But I was ultimately afraid of the idea, what if I go to get help? What if I try everything and I'm still sick? Then I'm hopeless. So in my twisted logic, as long as I'm like self-medicating, all of the treatments that were otherwise untried were hopeful in some weird way.
Wow.
And so it's amazing. Like, as long as I could just keep those out there, I'll handle it. But I basically didn't have the guts. And I didn't have the guts to say, hey, we're gonna do whatever we can to figure this out. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but we're gonna try it. Nor did I have the guts, or really just even the wherewithal or awareness, to understand how sick I was, to raise my hand and say, I'm not doing well and I can't fix this on my own.
So Brooke's watching this. She's watching you self-destruct, and she's got to just be so frustrated, just hands tied.
Yep.
The man she loves is slowly dying in front of her. How does your relationship grow in that environment?
It doesn't. So, I mean, it deteriorated. Essentially we were, I would say, kind of running on and her perspective on it would be far more circumspect than mine was or is. But we were running on emotional fumes of just like, hey, you're out and you're home and new house and new job and, all these things. And also, fatherhood, because, Brooke was a single mom when I met her. And so by the time I got home, my stepdaughter, Gracie, was, she was 6 at the time. And so like another thing, to step into that you're wasn't prepared for. But ultimately, she just got tired. She got tired of watching it, and she got tired of being pushed out, and she got tired of being excluded. And, our home fell apart because it was effectively two people who liked each other and did a pretty good job of cohabitating that were not submitted to the Lord. And that was 100% on me, and that were certainly not submitted to one another. And so our marriage just continued to deteriorate during that time.
Did it end in divorce?
It did. We were ultimately, I moved out of the house in 2009, and we filed divorce paperwork, that year.
You've lost everything at this point. The recession is in full swing.
The funny thing was, the one thing that was, I would say the one thing that was working, the Lord was faithful throughout all of that. But other than the stress of work, my practice at the firm was growing exponentially.
Oh, interesting.
In part because I had inherited a bunch of clients from folks who had left, but also in part because you have people who are becoming trauma bonded to you through the course of the Great Recession. So now, you are their critical lifeline as it relates to the money that you're managing for them. So, I can distinctly remember that summer of 2009, divorce paperwork had been filed. I'm on a top advisor rewards trip that was supposed to be to New York, but that got downgraded to Seattle. And so I'm in Seattle, just kind of sitting there, drinking beer and watching TV on the company's dime, just sort of feeling like, well, I guess this is what success feels like. Doesn't feel like because you have that, it almost compared and contrasted that which is of, not that it's bad to succeed at business, but the value of that relative to what was being lost couldn't be compared.
So success didn't feel successful.
Didn't feel good. So
wow. That's amazing. I think just it's weird. I can't put myself in your shoes. There's so many elements to your story that I'm just like, it's hard to relate to you. It's hard to relate to the story.
Yeah.
How, where does it go from there? Where do you find yourself? You're no longer married. You're in a bar in Seattle. And so this is life. This is it.
Sort of like that's the point at which, you start realizing that you're kind of in the middle of a blast radius, and that the reality of divorce can solve some problems, but it creates a myriad of others. And it's no condemnation on anyone who's gone through divorce or experienced it. But it is death. Don't be mistaken about that. It's absolutely death. Even if the alternative seems completely unbearable. And so you're grieving. That was a time where, I started, that was enough of a wake up call for me, where I started actually seeing a counselor. And that in of itself was helpful, just to sort of have somebody, it's like you have this gaping wound that you've never admitted or realized or had somebody diagnose as a wound. And so that in of itself is kind of the first step, which I'm pretty sure is the first step in any 12-step program, is admit that there's a problem. And so oddly enough, like our separation and then subsequent divorce created space for me to sort of just like kind of figure some stuff out.
Yeah, turn introspective.
Yeah, and the Lord was consistently pursuing. The Lord was consistently, faithful in that, and so I started turning back more in that time frame and seeking more. I was still drinking and I was still doing my thing, but just realizing that maybe the thing that I've pushed out of my life is exactly the thing that is essential to my life and my being, which is, relationship with my Creator. And so, that started, the ship started kind of turning a bit during that time. And ultimately we were divorced, and Brooke and I began to reconcile during that time. And so, yeah.
So there's a moment where, you hear the voice of God, and that even sounds crazy just saying that out loud. Like, that's people on the street say that who are crazy. But you clearly heard God's voice. It was one word. What was it?
Yeah, he just said stop. And it was, I was literally making decisions at that point in time that it's like I was unwittingly writing my own allegory as far as that goes. I was hiking on Mount Rainier and making stupid decisions on the trail that I shouldn't have been making to try and challenge myself, and found myself lost and in a pretty dangerous, well, I wouldn't say lost. Brooke would say that I was lost. I knew where I was at.
Classic.
Within a few square miles. I was out on the Carbon River Glacier, and I experienced that was the 4th of July weekend of 2009. I experienced the beauty and ecstasy of going off the trail and going in places that maybe you're not supposed to go. And then the danger of that. And I was not going to church. I was not, whatever Christian disciplines you're supposed, I was not anywhere in that boat. But as I was contemplating my next steps, as I'm holed up next to a tree, shivering, waiting for daylight to finish my hike, he spoke. And I don't really know how to describe it. There's nothing that I could say, that I could write that would encapsulate it.
You say it pretty beautifully, though, in the book. You say it's the force of his voice unleashed a torrent of rational thought.
Yeah, it's like that was said, and it was just like a cosmic 2x4 just to your chest. It was just, but at the same time, it was completely loving.
Wow.
There was not even a hint of condemnation. There was not a hint of judgment, but you're just brought back to reality, which is you're loved and you're mine, and you need to stop and turn around, literally and metaphorically. And it's almost embarrassing that it took that in some respects, because I can look back and I can see moments where he was speaking all along, but for whatever reason, I wasn't listening, and it took that kind of experience for me. I guess I'm that dense to actually perk my head up and say, maybe this isn't working. Maybe life according to Steven, trails according to Steven, maybe I'm not my own maker or the one who is best suited to chart a course for myself. And so I'd like to say that everything changed and it was a 180, and it was but that was the apex of my waywardness, and from that point I can trace a walk back home.
There's another moment of healing in your journey, and you were at a men's retreat at your church.
It wasn't even a church. It was just a group of other people, spiritual people, frankly, that given my more traditional Christian background, frankly, made me super uncomfortable. Because it was like there was nothing I was familiar with about it. It was just a friend of mine who had invited me. And at that point, this is years after that, when Brooke and I reconciled in 2010, we were in a much better place for a lot of reasons. Number one, we were following Jesus together, but then also the fact that I had PTSD, and the fact that, the reason why, I was medicating in that way wasn't because of her. It wasn't because of, at least the disease was named, but the disease was there nonetheless. And so, this is chronicled in the book, but essentially, when you're drinking a lot, working a lot, dealing with nightmares and just struggling with the mental health dynamic, that doesn't work well on your physical or mental health. And so by the time 2015 rolled around, 4 years ago, I was, for the first time in my life, seriously contemplating suicide. Just because, not because I didn't have things to live for, but I was just so tired. I was so tired of having, it felt like my being hijacked by these memories and by this experience that was still so visceral. When I would lay down in bed at night, I could still, and all the other noises of life get turned down. Have those quiet moments, which I, for years, abhorred. I could feel the butt stuck of my weapon in my shoulder. It was as if I could reach out and touch it. That's how imprinted in my being that experience was. And I kept reliving it. And so I just wanted to be done. And that was the place that I found myself, 4 years ago.
You mentioned Chaplain Jones and you saying, I just want it to stop, but it won't stop. I just want it to be in the past. And it's just something that would just haunt you. It never went away. Never went away.
No. And it was, a lot of that is, it's, we're whole beings, and I'm no clinician, but I know that whenever we try, and sometimes we have to isolate aspects of our being to try and treat it. Like if, I'm sitting, eating a fudge sundae, complaining about my diabetes, I don't need somebody to lay hands on me.
Right.
I need somebody to say, stop it. You're eating crap, So it's not to over-spiritualize everything, but at the same time, we are spirits that live in a body. I believe that. And I know that my sickness was biochemical. I had stuff that was firing in my brain that was making me feel as though I was in a war, and when I wasn't, and I wasn't able to override that with my conscious thoughts. But I also know that it was spiritual, and I believe that for me, when, healing of that finally came, the main thing that it took for me to be healed wasn't some, alchemy or witchcraft of you go to this place and you do that thing and you say this, whatever. I had to be brought to a place where I admitted and embraced my complete weakness and my complete dependence, that I could not fix myself. And I had to be brought to a place of true humility. And it's not to say that I'm the epitome of humility in any respect. I have an ego and I have pride. But the fact that it took me, 12 years from the point of being at war to be healed of the wounds, the unseen wounds of that war, was in some respect maybe a reflection of the severity of those wounds, but it was also a reflection of my own pride and my own, my own stubbornness, frankly, to actually come to a place where it's just like I'm desperate enough that I'll go to a nameless spiritual retreat because I don't know what else to do.
Sure.
Because I've tried everything else and I'm still sick. And so I am without hope. And so, sure, I'll go. Why not?
So it's the age-old, problem. We take young men who are human beings with hearts that are beating passionately for life and, for wholeness and for purpose. And we send them to war, and they come home changed. They come home with experiences, a lot of them like yours, you know, and then we just kind of expect them to reemerge into society. And that's, because you're basically at a point where if you ask for help, that you're weak.
That's right.
And you've been trained the last, for war. It's like, you don't be weak when you're a soldier. Right. So how do you get to that point where you just can say, I need help here. And where is that help for veterans?
For me, I had to get to the place of, I had to get to that place of just brokenness where it's just like, I am screwed.
What a gift. I mean, honestly.
That's right. Exactly right. It was. And the thing, and that's so often the case, how many times is it, it's just like, oh my gosh, as long as I don't have to talk to that person today. It's like, how often is that the one person that you needed to talk to, or they needed to hear something from you. Like, what is the thing that you're dreading or you're afraid of, which may be exactly the thing that the Lord has for you to lean into.
Right.
That's not always the case. You can't take that as some sort of, trite saying, don't put that on a coffee mug or anything. But I think there is some truth to that. There certainly is to me of like, he is not the author of fear. And so if there is fear, it doesn't mean that you go do it. I'm not saying that, the thing that you're afraid of, but it is to say, I think there's an invitation to bring that before him and say, what's going on here? Like, and for me, I was just, the muscles of self-reliance, the muscles of independence are the ones that always got rewarded, not the muscles of codependence. Codependence isn't a dirty word, but in our society, it largely is. And particularly in that culture, it largely is, which is strange because so much of the effectiveness, even of a special operations community culture, isn't based on the individual. It's based on the functionality of the unit. So that should be the place where codependence in a healthy way is the most welcomed. But I think largely because of stigma and because of the culture, it isn't. And so there's a lot of guys, I was one of them, who, not everyone who goes to war comes back with PTSD or an unseen wound, just like not everyone comes back with a gunshot wound. But the ones that come back with gunshot wounds, we can treat them and identify them, and it's safe to get that treatment. And for a lot of folks within the military, the active duty component, it is still practically, in some cases, policy-wise unsafe, but then practically, culture-wise, still very unsafe, where you'll be told, by all means, raise your hand and ask for help. Well, depending on the community, that can be effectively synonymous with ending your career. Or, you needed to talk to a chaplain on deployment. Great. Why didn't you go ahead and have that conversation at Fort Lewis? We'll just go ahead and send you home. I know guys in my unit who in subsequent deployments in 2nd Platoon, the only way they were able to get mental health, even just have a conversation, their squad leaders identified stuff that was going on, not that they weren't combat effective, but like they're dealing with stuff. So they had to get them in front of a Navy shrink completely off the books in order for those conversations to happen, because they knew that if they raised their hand and said, I'm at the tip of the spear and I need to have a conversation, then that's basically a binary switch that gets flipped that says, well, then you can't be at the tip of the spear. And some of that is okay, just like you don't want to put somebody back in the game that's clearly not physically able to play. It's like, if you're hurt bad enough, we don't want you out there. But at the same time, you sprain your wrist, it doesn't mean you can't play in the Super Bowl. So we don't have, I don't believe, the full spectrum of understanding that it's not either you're an alpha warrior capable of kicking down all manner of doors, or you're fit for a straitjacket. That's essentially, that's at least my understanding. That's how I understood it, was there's guys who need mental health treatment that are veterans, and those are the guys that are homeless in surplus jackets begging for change. I wear literally a white collar to work. I manage other people's money. I have a job a lot of people would kill for. And on top of that, the trauma that I'm experiencing was in some degree caused by me. So then it's not only what do you have to be sorry about, but it's, even if you have a wound, do you, Steven, as somebody who was a shooter in this incident, do you even deserve to have that wound to be treated? And for me, for a lot of years, the answer to that was no.
How do you reform that? I mean, I think we're starting to have the conversation where it's PTSD is being talked about.
Yeah.
Is it being adequately addressed? Are there options now? Has the military changed? How do you reform this? I guess that's my question.
It's a great question. So, and that's key, and that's at the heart. That's why War Story has even been written, is not to tell this journey, but to put that story in service of highlighting a greater issue. I say it in the author's note that if the book is worth reading, I'm biased, I think it is, but if it's worth reading not because it's unique, but precisely because it's ordinary. Because the only thing unique about War Story as it relates to the military is the fact that it included somebody who happened to play in the NFL. And that's no dishonor to Pat or his memory. He was an extraordinary person, but he's one of 6,000 people that have died in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he's and I'm one of countless others who have experienced the pains of war, whether they were in uniform or not. And so it's a big problem. I think it's worth noting that we've come a long ways. if you go back, you look at the burdens that the Vietnam generation suffered under, PTSD wasn't even a diagnosis.
Yeah, there's no identifier.
None whatsoever. And so the road that generation of veterans has paved to even get where we're at is significant. And that's worth noting, because I think it's too easy to look at the VA or to look at, what have you, and just simply say it's all broken, it's all a mess. There's lots of amazing people working every day within the active duty component and within the VA component that if it weren't for them, the 22-a-day suicide statistic amongst veterans, I'm sure, would be even higher. So in seeking to reform, put things back together as they should be, I think it's worth noting how far we've come. We've partnered with those that have studied this extensively and practiced also in the active duty military. And we've, with them, really driven by their research, we're putting forth 17 recommendations to the Department of Defense, to the chairs of the Senate and the House Armed Services Committee, to say, hey, these are 17 things that need to change. Things like policies that reinforce stigma and getting help. Things like, just was told a story for a friend of mine, a guy that he knows, SF guy, 18-year Green Beret veteran, did something really stupid off the battlefield, but overseas, something that absolutely should have consequences. But the consequence that he's receiving as an 18-year veteran is a dishonorable discharge, which means he gets no pension and he gets zero access to any VA benefits or any treatment. So instead of, how many planes has he jumped out of? How many compressed discs in his back and jacked up knees does he have from effectively being an SF operator? The Army gets to say, we owe you nothing because you did this one thing. Those policies have to change because all that does, what do you think that guy's going to do? The career that he's had for 18 years is gone. The pension is gone. He's sitting at home drinking beer, watching infomercials. So there's a litany of things like that where at the active duty level, we can, I believe, help move the needle from a policy standpoint. But simply moving the needle from a policy standpoint is not good enough because, for me, the answer was not in going to the right clinician, even though that's good. That can be really good. Ultimately, the answer is, for me, I had so many people around me who would have been willing to counsel and listen and pray and cry with, and I was too afraid. I was too afraid to raise my hand and say, this is who I am, and this is what I've experienced, and this is what I've done. And so until we as humans, regardless of what we've gone through, until we can do that within the confines of community, there won't be healing. There might be medication, which can be helpful. I'm not demeaning that, but I believe that the answer really lies in healthy vulnerability and in folks who they may feel that their best years of service are behind them because they're not in the military anymore. But the reality is, the guys and folks that they served with, they need them just as much now as they ever did. And so there is a policy component. And that bleeds over into a cultural component. If you just have policy stapled to the wall, but practically speaking, nobody does it, it doesn't matter. That's a loss. And so that's only going to change one story at a time. I believe telling stories is central to that. And that's one of the reasons why, I believe so much in what Nations is doing is because it's not about a particular agenda. It's just about this is what people are experiencing. This is where they're hurting. This is where they're confused, and that's okay. This is where they're hopeful. And how do we meet each other where we're at in the journey? That's really, I think that's really the answer is community.
Yeah, Nations Media, we love stories like yours because it's a narrative that if it was just a war story, if it was just a book that didn't have an invitation, it would just be another, war story.
That's right.
I love that you are a reformer. You're not content with the outcome of how society is dealing with men and women who are facing this very horrific reality of PTSD, and you're not content with just prescribing antidepressants. You say that eventually it was just as depressing just taking the antidepressant, and I think just being numb and remote is not a solution.
No.
And I love that you're willing to posture yourself in this place to bring about, I think, gospel reconciliation, hope, change, salvation, and I'm so grateful to know your story. I know everyone who's listened to your story and who will read the book, because there's so much more information in the book. It's a must read. Is going to greatly benefit and be blessed. So, Steven, your story, why don't you take us home? Where are you at today, you and Brooke and your family? What does that look like today?
Yeah, it's great. We live in Olympia still. My day job, I work for a company called Capstone Trusts. We do trust administration and estate settlement, so similar or at least related to the field I was in previously. We have 2 girls. Gracie is now a teenager. She's 17. And,
wow.
And we have Hazel, who is going to be 7 here in a couple months. And so those 2 girls keep us on our toes for sure, and keep life interesting. But yeah, and we're, spending more and more time, on not just, the book is written, it's done, but certainly spending more time now leaning into sort of the policy change aspect of this, which is really, really exciting.
So you've got a monumental road ahead of you.
Well, I don't know. It's a road of some sort.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
We'll take one step and one day at a time. But yeah, we feel. There's good days and bad days. There's good weeks and bad weeks, and we have our struggles. There's no question. We're still human. We're still sinful. We still have to forgive and be forgiven each and every day. So that is still our reality. But we are very much at a place where we are able to reflect on just grace, on things that we've been given that we have not deserved on any level. And so we want to, our hope in our heart is to respond to that and do likewise to others because of what he's done for us.
That's incredible. Steven, thank you for your vulnerability, for your courage. Where can we join the journey to be part of some of these solutions? Obviously, pick up a copy of the book.
Yep.
And does the book explain how we can participate, or if people are hurting and in the process of needing help and needing healing?
Yes. Yeah, there's the postscript of the book kind of outlines that. There's a couple of immediate responses, I guess. One is, so we've set up a nonprofit to handle financial proceeds in the book, and then ultimately give those away. But then that nonprofit also serves as a platform for policy advocacy. And so we have drafted a petition that includes those 17 initiatives addressed to the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of both Armed Services Committees. To basically say, hey, we want to engage in a collaborative conversation to see these things happen. And so you can go to elliottfund.org, 2 L's, 2 T's, elliottfund.org, and you can sign that petition. You don't have to give us any money. We're not even accepting donations. That's not the point, but just lending your voice if you believe those are changes you want to see happen. And then we're also partnered with an organization called Reboot Combat Recovery that is doing an amazing job of helping to facilitate really small group, in-home, peer-led trauma healing. And so if you're looking for, if you're a spouse, if you're a veteran, if you're on active duty and you're saying, I feel alone, I need help, I would encourage you to check them out and talk to the folks at Reboot. I know in the Puget Sound area, there's a lot of Reboot groups that are already going, and they're operating, I think, over 200 groups in 5 different countries now and growing rapidly. And so that's a critical community-based option. And certainly, if you're in crisis, by all means, the Veterans Crisis Hotline, the Suicide Prevention Hotline, pick up the phone and call, talk to somebody. You're not alone. I've been there. Others have been there. And there's a lot of people who would just love to help and love to listen, if nothing else. So those are some ways that you can respond.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much for your time. This is our first podcast.
Yeah.
And so stoked that you are the first reformer that we're featuring. And thank you for serving on our board of directors.
Yeah, of course.
We look forward to releasing this. I want to thank Jeff Marsh for helping us out. I want to thank our friend Ryan Frederick, Crux Watches, for supporting this.
Yes.
And and again, thank you for just selflessly giving your narrative away. I see Jesus in that. Jesus was the master storyteller, and he invited us into the narrative, and I think you've done the same. So thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Joel.
Yeah, brother.
Appreciate it, man.
All right, man.